All right. Well, it's right about 7, so I think we can start with some introductions and let the next few people trickle in. Thanks all for joining today. My name is Jack McDermott. I'm a project assistant with Long Live the Kings. And today we are joined by Russ Ladley, who's the Puyallup Tribe's Fisheries Director, and Jacques White, who's Long Live the Kings Executive Director. And Russ is going to be talking about the Electron Dam on the Puyallup River, and you all will get to learn a little bit more about what's going on that river. Russ, do you want to give a brief introduction?
Sure. Yeah, my name is Russ Ladley. I've been a biologist with the Puyallup Tribe for 3 decades. I've been working on a variety of fisheries enhancement projects, mitigation, hatchery issues, hydropower, flood control, a little bit of timber fish and wildlife issues in there as well. So a variety of background issues.
Great. Well, we're really excited to have you joining us today, and thank you so much for taking your Wednesday evening to present on this topic. And Jacques, do you want to give a brief introduction as well?
Sure. Hi, I'm Jacques White. I'm the Executive Director along with the Kings. I want to welcome everybody to this presentation and thank Jack for putting this together and Russ for joining us. Really appreciate this. We're trying to, I know a lot of people are cooped up inside and not getting to do as much as they want. So we've been stepping up our digital presentations to make sure that the stuff that we're doing and the stuff that our important work that our partners are doing, like Russ, gets out to folks and you have a chance to learn more about what things are going on around Puget Sound in the Pacific Northwest to recover salmon and steelhead. If you don't know about Long Live the Kings, we're an over 30-year-old organization focused on recovering wild salmon and steelhead and supporting sustainable fishing. And we believe that fishing is an integral part of conservation because it builds a connection to the resource and motivates folks to make sure that we have salmon for current and future generations. We've been working on a number of different projects. I won't go into all of them. If you want to learn more about us, go to our website. It's real easy. It's lltk.org. You can learn about stuff that we're doing. But one of the areas I will talk real quickly about is our interest in barriers to salmon migration. About 6 years ago, or 7 years ago, we started to understand that the Hood Canal Bridge was a big barrier to migration for all of the steelhead in Hood Canal, and that there was apparently some significant mortality at the bridge. And we've been working really hard on that issue, and you can read about that on our website. But we also started thinking about other barriers in different rivers in Puget Sound in particular, but in Washington State in general, where are there places where we could work with partners to identify significant blockages that are not only preventing recovery of ESA listed or Endangered Species Act listed Chinook and other salmon, but also might be limiting certain populations to a degree that they're limiting the opportunities to fish on these stocks here in Puget Sound and out in the Pacific Ocean. In other words, to get into Byzantine fisheries management, there are certain stocks here in Puget Sound that are driving all fishery management decisions up and down the West Coast for Chinook. And with the complication of southern resident killer whales needing a diet supplement and their primary food being Chinook, it's really amplified our interest in trying to identify specific projects, particularly barriers like dams or blockages like the Hood Canal Bridge or blockages like the Ballard Locks in Seattle, that if we can address the passage issues and improve survival there, we might be able to restore those stocks. So there are 5 places that we are really focusing on. One is the Hood Canal Bridge. One is the Enloe Dam on the Similkameen River in eastern Washington near Okanagan. That was written up in the paper by Linda Mapes recently in the Seattle Times. The Ballard Locks, where we are working to help with fish passage there and reduce mortality due to predation, and also looking at high temperatures in the Ship Canal. And the Middle Fork Dam on the Nooksack River, which we've been working with American Rivers and the Paul G. Allen Family Foundation to get funding for that project. And happy to say that the American Rivers removed that dam this last year, and now it's opening up 16 miles of Chinook and steelhead habitat on the middle fork of the Nooksack River. And then the last project is the Electron Dam, which we think is on a prime Chinook habitat area, blocking fish passage in 2 directions, and an important thing that we might be able to work on to address this issue. And not only is Long Live the Kings focused on this, but the entire Puget Sound Salmon Recovery Council, which allocates funding, both federal and state, for habitat restoration projects in Puget Sound, has identified this as an important issue. So with that build up, I'll hand it over to Russ.
Thanks, Jock. Yeah, I guess before I get going onto the presentation, I want to thank Long Live the Kings for their interests and their partnership. As you mentioned, partnerships are the key to success in this line of work. Fish do not recognize political boundaries. We all have to accept that everything we do has an effect on some stream, some creek, and ultimately Puget Sound. And that environment is key to protecting fish and restoring runs. So thank you all for your interest in the Electron hydroelectric project. And with that, we'll get started with the first slide.
Sure. So thank you both for that detailed introduction. I just want to jump in really quick before Russ gets into his presentation and let everyone know that at the end of this presentation, we'll be having a Q&A with all of our remaining time. And so if you can find on your menu bar of your Zoom webinar, you can find down here at the bottom a Q&A box, and that will allow you to type a question and then submit it. And then at the end, I'll go through, review the questions, and then we'll go over them with Russ and Jacques and be able to have a nice discussion based on the questions that you all are interested in. So nothing else from me. Russ, I'm handing it over to you.
Okay, if you can tee up that first slide. Somebody already asked where the Electron Dam is. So here we go. You see Mount Rainier. Mount Rainier is the source of the Puyallup River watershed, made up of 3 glacial rivers, the White, the Carbon, and the Puyallup. The White being the largest of the 3, and the Puyallup actually the smallest. Electron Dam is located at River Mile 41. Next slide, please. So the timber crib structure you see to the right is the original dam design dating back to 1904. The fish ladder on the left was added in the year 2000 as a result of a settlement between the Puyallup Tribe and Puget Sound Energy, the original owner of the project. The project was since sold to Electron Hydro about 6 years ago. The elevation of the structure, by the way, is 1,600 feet. It's surrounded by industrial forest land, in this case, mostly Hancock timberlands. It's not a place where you can take the family on a car ride and go see unless you have an access pass on private timberlands. And it's all through a maze of logging roads. The diversion dam is just that. It serves to divert 400 cubic feet a second of water into this flume shown here, which then conveys that water 10.1 miles along the valley wall downstream. Next slide. Ultimately, that flume discharges into a 20-acre 4-bay reservoir. You can see the at the top right where it says flume flow line. That's where it enters after that 10.1 mile journey. There's a call out where it says penstocks there. That's where the water goes through 5 individual steel pipes, barrels 873 feet over the hillside to generate the power. Of course, when you're diverting 400 CFS from the river, you're also diverting all the fish in the river. In this case, the 400 CFS is about 78% of the flow of the Puyallup River at the point of diversion. The average flow is 525 CFS. Imagine trying to get a permit to divert 78% of a river today. Would not happen, especially a river with 3 listed species in it, bull trout, steelhead, and Chinook. So anyway, the fish enter this, and since that settlement date back in 1997, we've attempted to salvage those fish and safely take them downstream via this fish collection facility. It works, but it doesn't work well. We've done a number of tests. Puget Sound Energy also funded a test, and the success rate or survival rates vary markedly, anywhere from 5 to 80%. We know survival is a function of the diversion rate. The higher the diversion rate, the maximum diversion rate results in the lower survival. So you got 400 CFS coming in the flume and then 400 going out the penstocks. And the little fish collection facility on the opposite side of the lake uses a 20 CFS pump to provide a surface attraction to collect mostly juveniles, but some occasionally larger fish are caught there. And then there's guide nets stretched over the forebay to try to push them in there. So again, the many tests we've done over the years indicates poor survival. That's why the tribe has advocated for a fish screening facility closer to the point of diversion. Next slide. This is the powerhouse 10 miles downriver. It's designed to generate up to 25 megawatts of power. If you're not used to thinking in terms of megawatts, that's roughly 34,000 horsepower. And as a reference to other hydroelectric facilities in the Northwest, 25 megawatts compared to like Bonneville Dam, you might be familiar with on the lower Columbia, that's a 1,000 megawatt facility. Grand Coulee on the upper Columbia is a 6,700 megawatt facility. So it's a very small scale hydroelectric plant. Next slide. And you're looking at the discharge again. Fish can be attracted to this. Certain times of the year, you can see schools of salmon here. Oftentimes, coho will wait a freshet event to before migrating upstream. Next slide. About midway through the Diversion Canal is a settling basin that is used to get material out of the flow line. During the summer months, when the maximum amount of sediment is naturally transported down the Puyallup River and other glacial rivers, typically all of July, August, and September, the owners have to remove 1,000 cubic yards of material every day just to maintain conveyance. It's a sizable effort. You can see the piles of sand behind the excavator shown here. Next slide. So those piles are then distributed in a storage yard with a very large bulldozer. Next slide. This is what that storage yard looks like from the air. You can see the long shaped lake used to settle. In the old days when Puget Sound Energy owned it, they actually employed a valve and a pipeline on the bottom of the reservoir here, and they would open that to sluice sediment back to the river. That practice was banned by the Department of Ecology in the early 1990s. That's the Puyallup River off to the right. Next slide. So getting back to the forebay, we've wrestled with technologies and trying to basically improve survival, catch as many of the fish that end up in the forebay as possible. But it's always a battle. The net that's used as a guide barrier tends to foul up. It can foul up, biofoul we call it, in the summer with algae. And after windstorms, you get a lot of blowdown material, fine organics that collect on it. During periods of heavy sediment discharge, it can actually weight down the net and fish get on the other side routinely. So that's part of the battle we've been facing. Those metal balls at the top of the screen, those hold big metal plates that serve to divert the flow direction toward the fish collector. By the way, anybody thinking about or knowing about fish behavior in a lake environment like this would not have put the smoke collection facility where it's located. They would have put it closer to the penstock so you can use the current in your favor to collect those fish. Next slide. The net requires staggering amount of maintenance depending upon the season and windstorms, but this is a device just used to clean it. They can use a water monitor, a high pressure hose to clean it off, and then pull it back and forth along these spools so that you're using new pieces of net similar to like a purse seiner almost, while you clean another section. Had to show some fish because this is ultimately all about fish protection. Here we got a yearling coho smolt and a yearling Chinook smolt that were collected from the forebay. This is what we love to see. It's all about saving the wild smolts. Next photo. As you can imagine, that steep section of the flume has to travel about 5 miles along the gorge length. And periodically you'll get slope failures, a tree will fall down, a large rock will come loose during a windstorm or a rain event, and it takes out the flume. So then at that point you have 400 CFS still moving through the flume, suddenly barreling down directly to the canyon below. When you fly the gorge, you can see the scars from flume breaks that date back over 100 years. It's pretty remarkable. Obviously a very hazardous work environment if you're one of those people that has to do the maintenance. Back to the fish ladder. The fish ladder was designed to operate ideally with 10 to 50 cubic feet per second. It's a modified chevron weir structure, which basically provides fish passage without any sediment in the cells, or can act as a roughened channel when following a large flood event, for example. The ladder becomes full of gravel and sediment, which is what you see here. In this case, the trash rack at the top of the fish ladder is blocked by organic debris and does require periodic maintenance. So we'll get up there, and the project owners also share the responsibility of ensuring water is flowing through that ladder. If there's no water flowing through the ladder, then there's no fish passage, and fish passage must be required. Next slide. Here's the forebay penstock. They call it the raker shack. In front of the penstocks is a bar screen setup. The bars are spaced 1 inch apart. So any fish that is less than 1 inch wide, which typically, depending upon the species, corresponds to a fish length of about 200 to 250 millimeters, 25 centimeters. So what this translates into is that any fish smaller than a couple-year-old steelhead smolt, for example, can be lost to the penstocks. In other words, can be pulled into that facility where they're running through a Pelton Wheel. The floating structure to the right is an old dredge that hasn't been used in probably 15 years. It's no longer permitted. They used to, when Puget owned it, they dredge the material and again dump it directly over the hill into the Puyallup River. So periodically, the forebay does need to be maintained. Puget used to do it once a year. They drain it, and when they do that, it's an absolute disaster for fish life. Over the years, we've learned how to minimize that loss, but there's no way to avoid it entirely. The new owner encountered this problem for the first time in their ownership. They drained it this year for maintenance, and it was a disaster. We lost fish of all age classes, including adult steelhead that had basically 5 years of time to recruit in there. Bull trout love this environment because essentially all the smolts and young of the year fry are being brought in. It's just a smorgasbord. So they show rapid growth rates. The best way to get them out, we found, is actually hook and line and put them in the truck and release them downstream. We've actually tagged those with pit tags and found that several of them actually take the migration back up the river and come back into the forebay. Next slide. Another view of the bar screens. You can see the liability of this design in allowing all small fish to simply pass through. And because all that slime and sediment that deposits there, the work environment, the struggle of collecting fish, it's brutal work. Unfortunately, most of the smaller fish get through and you're left trying to salvage basically fish over 8 to 10 inches is what we end up with. Next slide. This is a Pelton Wheel. I wanted to show you the photo on the right. You can see a cone. That's the exciter nozzle. That device is a needle that's used to move in and out to control the discharge. A Pelton Wheel bucket is actually a knife-edged shape. It's designed to harvest every last bit of energy, kinetic energy from that stream of water. In the case of Electron here, we have 873 feet of head. When the water exits that discharge nozzle, it's traveling at about 230 miles an hour. Next slide. I'm sure most of you have heard about improved survival of smolts at hydroelectric facilities. And that's all well and good. It's a true fact, and a lot of improvements are coming online in the last 10 years. But just know, when you're talking about survival of fish through a hydroelectric facility, it's always in reference to either a Kaplan turbine system or a Francis, never a Pelton Wheel. The velocities associated with a Pelton Wheel system mean there's no survival. There's no way to survive that. And the difference primarily is the water in a Kaplan or Francis is moving through the veins, imparting energy through that movement, and the fish travel through around the blades, unlike a Pelton Wheel where the nozzle is shooting directly into a steel blade. Next slide. So now I'm going to jump into what the current owner is doing at the site. They started back in July 15th with the work. That was the opening of the in-water work period. They'd actually submitted plans and designs for permitting back in 2016 to get the Corps permit, to get the county shorelines permit, to get the state hydraulics permit. In this photo, go back there. You can see that the, well, maybe you probably wouldn't recognize it, but the river has actually been moved to the right bank. Convention is looking downstream. You're looking upstream in this picture, but the entire river has been shifted to the right bank here to dry out the work site where the new dam segment will be constructed. Next slide. So a slightly better view here. So again, the owner began work July 15th in accordance with his permit and shifted that water to the right. What we realized right away is that too much water was going into the fish ladder. It was well beyond that optimum 50 CFS, more like 150 CFS. And to the left of the yellow arrow that says fishway is where the fish ladder returns, and it's kind of in that boiling whitewater area. And that's basically the condition that remained throughout the construction period. To the left, where you see the orange rock dam labeled, that's where the new air bladder dam will be constructed. And the river is being contained to the right by a series of steel connex boxes you'll see in a better photo. The yellow arrow on the left indicates where water is diverted at the start of the flume. Next slide. For some reason, the owners decided to deviate from the plans that were approved by the permitting agencies. The use of connex boxes, for example, as a diversion structure was never mentioned. The use of a high-density polyethylene liner, and certainly not the use of artificial turf as a padding to that liner. Almost immediately after work commenced, they noticed that the liner material and the padding underneath, which was the artificial turf, was tearing loose. As artificial turf, as you probably know, has a variety of crumb rubber elements in it to dissipate energy. And that material was also brought in on site, mystifying everybody who learned about it. But of course, because it's fairly light, semi-buoyant, it was rapidly distributing downriver. A number of efforts were put forth to try to figure out just how fast this material was moving. And basically, wherever you look downstream, you can find this if you look closely enough. It's almost the size of coffee grounds. Again, neutral buoyancy. Most of it's probably in Commencement Bay by now, but if you look carefully on those sandbars or deposition areas along the river, you can still find the crumb rubber. Next slide. quick video showing the fish ladder entering below the dam. This is about a 1,500 cubic foot per second event, so a moderate rain event, but kind of highlights the problem that fish would encounter trying to move upstream. Keep in mind that this work period coincides with the return of Chinook salmon to the river. Next slide. This is the fish ladder, again, with too much water in it, about 150 CFS we estimated. The downside of this construction operation is that because of a variety of channel manipulations, unanticipated side effects of bringing the river to the right bank, and the turbulence created by that jetted water over the dam face, we believe that there was no fish passage for a period of 8 to 10 weeks through the ladder, essentially blocking the entire fall Chinook return. Next slide. Another shot at a lower, more moderate flow. This is probably, I'm guessing, 800 CFS. The problem with this condition, though, it's still about a 4-foot leap into that first cell of the fish ladder. Just for scale, that Connex box, that rusty metal box there, the lower one, that's 8 foot in width. You can see those rocks. Those are called jetty stone when they get that size. Basically 1 rock per dump truck. And there's hundreds and hundreds of these used in the construction of this site just to try to stabilize it. Next slide. This, again, is a slightly higher flow condition, probably, again, about 1,500 CFS. You can see the violent maelstrom created at the intersection of the fish ladder on the far left, actually blocked by the dirt pile here, meeting the flow of the river. And then some of the HDPE, that plastic liner used to isolate, that was constantly being tore off for the duration of this construction period. We've spent a number of days looking around downstream, finding bits and pieces of this material that is scattered for miles now. Next slide. In this case, the Connex boxes were actually shifting, and the workers had to come out and try to weld them together to keep them from moving. So there's incredible amount of force associated with even though it's only a 12-foot drop and about 1,500 CFS, stream flow velocities here are approaching 18 feet per second. So that's very energetic. Next slide. So this was what was proposed as part of the initial permit package submitted to the agencies and the tribe for review back in 2016. The timber crib structure at the top of the dam remains in place. A center wall is going to be poured in the middle of the river channel, and then a new concrete foundation to support the air bladder dam. And then all the accessory work to basically dry out the site, allow for footing installation, rebar forms, and all that kind of work associated with putting lots of concrete in the river. Next slide. Here's the site. This is taken, I believe, mid-October. The green pump on the left is doing double time. All the pumps on site, they had a hard time keeping up with the groundwater. Anyway, it's discharging through a series of pipes that takes the water further downstream, but that rusty metal structure to the left of that green pump is the intake that's being fortified with a more robust intake structure. Water will be permitted into that when the steel plates that are installed right now are removed. The center wall it sits on a 4-foot deep reinforced steel concrete pad, so it's not going anywhere. Next slide. Next one, there we go. And just another angle of it kind of gives you a sense of scale with that worker on the wall, just how big this structure is and how robust its design is. Next slide. So later in the season, we're getting antsy about the delay in fish passage, and still the environment for fish passage is just not conducive. When you design a fish ladder, you need to provide an attraction flow to get fish to the start of the ladder, you have to provide for a jump height that fish can make, and you also have to allow the fish to stage that jump. In other words, prepare and get the right velocity in the jump to move upstream. Clearly, none of those conditions is afforded under these conditions. Next slide. This is an aerial view. So we went back and forth with the agency fish passage engineers, arguing about how best to improve the situation, try to diminish some of that flow velocity and allow fish a better access environment. A number of different efforts were tried, mostly involving moving large pieces of rock around in different configurations. This is slightly improved, but the jump is still too much. The velocities are still too high. And in all likelihood, this won't remain following a high flow event that pushes those rocks out of the way. Next slide. So getting back to the original permit submittal package, what you see in blue was part of that original 2016 design. Once the county and the Army Corps of Engineers issued a stop work order because of violations to the permits, which was early September, the owners came back with a different plan, knowing that when they weren't going to be able to get all the work done by the September 15th cutoff date. So they came up with this plan to develop essentially a roughened channel at the site to allow for work to commence the following summer, in other words, next July 2021, and stabilize the site for the winter. And this involved a placement of 8,500 yards of jetty stone, 6-man rock, as it's called out here. That's all shown in red. So keep in mind, this is what has occurred, yet there was no permits issued for it, no 404, no hydraulics permit, no shorelines. The structure is in place today, and it's a structure without precedence anywhere in the Northwest. Our concern primarily is how fish respond to this now that it's here. The initial concern is downstream migrating smolts. What's their fate if they enter the voids between the large rocks? How much water is going to be moving through them to attract adults through this false passage, because they're not going to be able to make it past it. And you'll see that in the forthcoming slides. Next slide. This is a side profile of it. The green structure would be the top of the air bladder dam once it's installed. The rock structure that was intended to winterize essentially reaches the same elevation, that key elevation of 1,620 feet, which is designed basically to ensure that they can go back to generation, diversion and generation, and of course that means revenue generation for throughout the winter. Next slide. Let's give you a better indication of what that air bladder will look like. And the idea here is that rather than moving all that sediment into the flume where it's a total liability, the material will naturally build up behind the dam. They can deflate it and it'll just wash downstream. It's apparently a pretty robust rubber dam. It would have to be, because keep in mind, we're going to be recruiting large old growth trees from Mount Rainier National Park, which will come sailing through this at high flows and then floods. And I suspect dragging a big root ball behind them. So whether that rubber can stand up to that force and impact, time will tell. Next slide. Again, this is what's in place today. All those voids created by the large rock, the water moving through it it's very concerning to us. And unfortunately, there's no requirements to test it and see how fish of all age classes will respond. It's a complete unknown. Next slide. A summary of what we've got now. Construction of the left bank and center pier is complete. No fines have been levied by the regulatory agencies, the permitters, as a result of permit deviations. I mentioned before that the 4 permits in hand all were violated. That includes the Section 401, 404 with the Corps, county shorelines, and the state hydraulics code. Still no Section 404 permit in hand to construct this dam that's now complete and in place. We believe that fish returns were blocked for a 10-week period ending October 28th when all in-water work was to cease. The owners did abide by that, got it all done by October 28th. Now we have a structure in place that we frankly have no idea how fish are going to respond to it. And we also have a lot of artificial turf and rubber pellets still in the river, as well as the HDPE liner that's drifted downstream. Next slide. So what has actually been done since the last 2 weeks of October? Well, water was restored to the original channel shown here. That's a roughened channel. It's hard to get a sense of scale here, but that is actually a 12-foot drop over about 100 feet of run. So it's a steep river environment. Next slide. This is the sheet pile wall, also that was not called out as part of the design. It goes down about 25 feet below grade level there. So it's not going anywhere, but unfortunately it's just oxyacetylene cut, so it's a very rough edge. In all likelihood, there's going to be a hydraulic pillowing, so fish will not make contact to it. Our concern at this point is what is the fate of those juveniles when they go back to diversion and you just get a little bit of water kind of cresting and dribbling over the top of that sheet pile into that rock, roughened channel downstream of it. Again, no tests, no monitoring required at this point. And just another angle of the sheet pile there. And next slide. So this is what it looks like when it's watered up. The fish passage engineers are kind of going back and forth as to whether it's even passable for steelhead or bull trout. I personally don't think they can make that run. Even if they got to the edge of the sheet pile, there's simply not an adequate staging area to make a jump. So they are reliant upon the fish ladder again, which would be fine except for the fact that most of the water is on the opposite side of the river channel. So how many fish are likely to find the entrance to the fish ladder on that far bank? You can see it over there. Again, you're right back to the situation we had at Buckley for decades, where fish are being attracted to the wrong portion of a dam. In all likelihood, some fish will find it through trial and error, but keep in mind that those fish are programmed to get from point A to point B in a certain period of time. And if they're wasting time and energy and exhausting themselves by being attracted to a location where they can't make safe passage, then that will impact their survival and their ability to reproduce successfully. Next slide. You get a slightly different perspective of what that roughened channel looks like and all that jetty stone that underlies it. And this is my last parting slide here, and this is the material that we've been collecting miles downstream. That's the artificial turf in the left picture, and a variety of the materials that have been broadcast downstream since the events that started back in mid-July. So that's the show, folks.
Well, thank you, Russ, for that detailed presentation. I hope it gave anyone who's watching good background to everything that's going on along the Puyallup River. If you two are ready, we can jump into the Q&A. It looks like we have a few questions, but I'll let the participants add any more questions of anything they're curious about as we continue. So give me 1 second to pull them up. Okay, so this is an anonymous question, and it asks, if the dam were to be removed, what is the restoration potential? How many miles of habitat would Chinook have access, and how many more fish could reasonably be added to the system as a result of a free-flowing river?
Great question. We could add 26 miles of unblocked habitat. That's just the main stem river, plus many more miles of smaller non-glacial tributaries where we currently see steelhead, coho, bull trout spawn. As far as how many fish you get back, well, that's a question that's been batted back and forth for years, and it's really a professional guess. I would like to think we could easily support 500 spring Chinook up there, 500 fall Chinook, a couple thousand coho, and probably 250 steelhead, maybe 100 bull trout. Those are just rough guesses based on similar habitat areas and the production we see on the White River, which is its closest comparison.
Wow, well, sounds like there's a lot of potential there.
There's a lot of potential, no doubt.
Brenda's asking, what sort of repercussions does the construction company receive as a result of this mess? So maybe you could go into a little bit on the tribe's plans to seek legal action, what's going on right now, and maybe what is in store for the future.
Yeah, again, a great question. Unfortunately, I'm not at liberty to disclose any legal issues here. The tribe is in litigation and pending litigation on a couple different fronts. We've appealed the hydraulics permit. We have a lawsuit engaged for 404 violations. EPA, we understand, is looking at possible enforcement. What that really entails is anybody's guess. We've certainly heard nothing thus far.
Okay, that makes sense. It still sounds pretty up in the air.
Very active. Yeah, there's I think 5 parties that have filed lawsuits now.
So. Hey, Jack, can I ask a follow-up question to Russ on a couple of those?
Yeah, of course.
Our way.
So how many fish do you anticipate are getting past the structure? Well, let me put it this way. Before the changes in the structure, sounds to me like you don't really understand how fish are going to use the structure now because it's been changed so much and it wasn't built to permit. But before that, what percentage of the fish that were arriving at the facility were making it adult fish, were making it past up through the fish ladder into the upper river?
Prior to construction, we believed there was no fish passage issues whatsoever. But at that point, the fish ladder was designed in kind of a hydraulic equilibrium with the river. That equilibrium is completely altered now because of all the excavation that's taken place. Granted, there will be some moderation of that over the winter as we get some high flows. They will stabilize things and hopefully get things back to a norm, but we don't know whether that's going to happen or not and when it's going to happen. And for example, right now, that initial jump height into the first ladder cell is over 2 feet, which exceeds agency criteria, but most large fish won't have an issue getting it over a 2-foot hurdle. Juveniles, however, will likely find a problem, particularly during higher flow events.
So also related to this, I know when the Puget Sound Salmon Recovery Council was having discussions with you about this issue, there was talk about an HCP and the need to complete an HCP. Can you describe for our audience a little bit about that, the Habitat Conservation Plan and for the facility and where that is and what the next steps are, or if any?
Yeah, the owners did distribute a draft HCP early last winter, late spring. The tribe made comments and submitted those comments. The agencies have made comments. It's got a long way to go. I will definitely tell you. It's a start, but it ignores a lot of the crucial fish passage concerns that the tribe has tried to bring to light. Primarily, those issues are associated with downstream migration. The owners have told us they'll come up with a screen device. The problem is that we've hired a couple different hydraulic engineers with decades of fish passage experience. And for example, one of the engineers is the guy who designed the fish ladder there at Electron. very skilled, very versed in hydraulic issues and fish passage. And he fully appreciates the challenge. There's so much debris, there's so much sediment. You can build a fish screen here, but the durability and is the question. What's going to happen once it gets beat up by a big flood event? Will the owners get back and repair it? Because we know it's going to get destroyed. It's just a matter of time. This thing is just so energetic. We've seen the damage done to the dams, and when you start adding fine screen, fine mesh stainless fish screens that are true, that meet agency criteria, they're going to require a tremendous amount of maintenance. We have a comparison on the white because Puget Sound Energy installed the Buckley fish screens back in 1996. But that facility has the benefit of having 4 settling basins in front of it. So a lot of the debris, a lot of the sediment has been removed. You don't have that luxury in this situation. You have a 2% channel slope, which is just a lot of energy. I wish there was a solution, but I mean, a lot of different fish passage engineers, reputable fish engineers from many agencies have looked at this and they just shake their heads. And it's a tough one. I'm not saying it can't be done, but it's going to cost a lot of money and the maintenance will be staggering.
So, Russ, I have another question from one of our participants. And I guess they're asking about a more, I know this presentation has been focusing on the Electron Dam and fish passage around the dam, but they were asking about more general conditions around the rest of the Puyallup River watershed. Could you maybe talk a little bit about how downstream fish passage is and how maybe a little bit about like rearing habitat up above the dam?
Okay, sure. So you've got 93 square miles of watershed upstream of the dam. You've got 1,000 square miles of watershed downstream of the dam. That's including the carbon and the white. So there's lots of rearing habitat. Again, we use this as a surrogate for comparison, what goes on the carbon and the white. The white primarily because we have a fish passage facility there. We know exactly how many adults of each species return each year. So that's a unique situation there in being able to quantify so accurately. It's much more challenging on the Puyallup because it's a glacial river. It's dirty. It's difficult to see what's going on. You can't count adults spawning in the main stem because the turbidity is simply too high. You can only count them in the non-glacial tributaries. So that all that production that occurs in the main stem is largely a guess unless you get a rare fall that's much cooler than normal, that glacial turbidity declines and you're actually able to see. We see steelhead, for example, the wild steelhead that come up and spawn in April and May. It's an entirely different flow condition than great visibility. So we have much better numbers for steelhead escaping up here. So again, it's industrial timberland. You can see the clear cuts in the background there. I'm not going to tell you it's all Mount Rainier National Park because it isn't. So you do have the typical flashiness associated with timber removal, high road densities in the neighborhood of 6 to 7 lineal miles per section in some areas. But it's still productive habitat. It's no secret that Commencement Bay has got more than its fair share of rearing habitat issues. I mean, it's got 2 of the 3 largest Superfund sites in the United States, basically in the tribe's front yard in the Port of Tacoma. It's a highly industrialized estuary. It has less than 1% of its historic habitat. But I mean, that's the condition. We have to make the most of it. And there's been a lot of restoration done in the last 30 years, a lot of cleanups. So we're optimistic because we have to be, and we've seen some improvements.
Well, thank you for all the work that you've been doing. We have another question that's asking about maybe a little bit more about the history of the area. And they were asking, is this a historical site? And do you think that that might complicate any of the efforts to modify or eliminate any existing structures?
Yeah, because it's vintage 1903, 1904, I've heard there's interest in preserving it as a historical area. I don't know the status of that. It's not something I follow in great detail. It does have a unique history. It's just so disappointing that this thing has been in opposition to fish passage and fish survival for so long. It's contradictory to everything the tribe stands for. I'd like to think that we could find a way around that in the future, but thus far it's stymied us. We don't see it. I don't know if that directly answers the question or not.
Yeah, I think you did. Another question's asking maybe about, they were asking if U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has engaged, and maybe you could talk about the partners that you've been working with, or everyone who's been engaged in maybe this issue, or even just the Puyallup River management during for your work.
Yeah, good. So we've been having weekly phone conversations, Zoom conversations with agencies, including Pierce County, State Fish and Wildlife, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Their interest, of course, is bull trout. National Marine Fisheries Service, the tribe, DNR, and Department of Ecology. I think that's everybody. Yeah. Yeah. So it's everybody who needs to be at the table is at the table. We want to see this thing minimized and the problems resolved. It's a challenge, though.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of different parts to this problem. We have another question that kind of relates to on the prospect of if the dam would be removed entirely, compared to working on projects to improve fish passage. Do you want to touch a little bit on if there's, well, maybe if you can touch a little bit on prospects for if the dam would actually be removed, and how much, what would it take to force this sort of removal, and any sort of details along that?
Yeah, I mean, the tribe would love to see the dam removed. That's its first, that's its preferred alternative, frankly. Whether that can happen or not, we don't know. We have an owner that's dedicated to generating power here. He's been putting a lot of money into revamping the facility. It includes new liners in the flume, the new dam itself. He's talking about rewinding the generators. Yeah, he's throwing a lot of money at this thing, there's no question. But yeah, dam removal is certainly an option. I mean, there's freshly poured concrete, but we've seen this just this summer what some explosives can do to concrete. I mean, removal is certainly an option. But you have to have a willing seller, and he has expressed no willingness to sell for that purpose. They have expressed no willingness to sell for that purpose.
I have a question, Jack. It's all right?
Yeah, go ahead.
So this is an old facility that does not require a FERC license. How does that factor into the management of the facility and the options for holding them accountable for particular management practices or meeting certain standards?
Yeah, great question. I meant to hit on that during my presentation and missed it, so thank you for asking that. Yeah, this, in the eyes of a private utility, this is the holy grail of the private utility hydroelectric industry, because it's unlicensed hydropower. FERC doesn't have their heavy hand of government on this, which means all the taxes associated with a FERC license, all the fish passage requirements do not exist. That's what makes this thing profitable. The owners have told us that if they had to get a license, they would walk away. That's what Puget Sound Energy did in 2004 on the White River Hydroelectric Project. They played every card in their hand to defer licensing. In 1963, for example, FERC said, Puget Sound Energy, you need to get a FERC license for the White River Project. They spent 40 years successfully deferring that license. And after they played all the legal shenanigans they could come up with, they closed it down and walked. This one is unique in the fact that FERC said they don't need a license, primarily because it predates the Federal Power Act of 1933. And the distinguishing factor between the Puyallup and the White is that FERC was never able to establish navigability or commerce to this reach of the river, unlike the White, where they floated shingle bolts logs down the river to sawmills. That's commerce that immediately triggers FERC licensing. That is the distinguishing factor. So what that means is that it kind of falls into a no man's land from a regulatory perspective. No agency has oversight of this operation. And we're aiming to fix that because that is not right. These guys have shown us that they need federal and state oversight. Who does it? I don't know. But the Department of Ecology, for example, has a dam safety assurance program. We know it doesn't meet their current criteria, but there is increasing effort to change the criteria that allows for their oversight. And we hope that changes soon.
Thanks.
Russ, this one is more directed for you. Someone was asking about how much extra time did you and your staff have to spend on this project versus conducting your own restoration and important projects for fish work on the Puyallup. So maybe you can talk a little bit about what else is going on in your world. And they also include during COVID. So maybe how you've adapted to that.
Yeah, I appreciate that question. This has consumed a terrifying amount of staff time. I've been billing almost 50% of my time to this since the initial notification of the artificial turf situation. Our legal team has spent many hours, hundreds of hours on this. We have field staff out there trying to basically make sure the fish ladder is functioning as intended, fish can get through it. We also have teams of people in their spare time trying to find artificial turf and more debris downstream. Some of the pieces are so big, for example, they can't move them. They are told to just take pictures, take GPS locations so that we can follow up and hopefully have the owners go collect them at some point in the future. The owner has told us repeatedly that they collected it all, but we know that's not true because every time we go out there, we find more of them. So the answer is we spent far too much time that's taken us away from all our other activities that we are tasked with doing.
We have one more question, and I think it was kind of directed at when you were outlining the permits that they had acquired for construction over the summer. Someone was asking, how common is it for companies to kind of disregard the approved plan and goes with what might just work for them? Do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, in my 3 decades of doing in-water construction, I've never seen any outfit go so completely off the rails so quickly in terms of what they were permitted to do, what they told the permitting agencies they were going to do, and what actually took place on the ground. I mean, to have a violation of all 4 permits so egregiously, that's a new one to me.
And kind of going
off. It's a new one to the agencies too, because you don't hear about stop work orders being issued by the Corps. In fact, when the Corps was thinking about issuing their stop work order, they had to open the manual, dust off the manual, and figure out how to do it because it's been so long since they'd actually done that.
And so kind of going off that, earlier you had mentioned there wasn't really any government oversight on this in terms of the licensing, but what sort of oversight comes in with following like regulations? Someone was asking about like the crumbling rubber and whether or not that was a regulated substance or material to use. What sort of regulations come into play when something like this happens?
Well, crumbling rubber, I'm not an expert in this field, but I'll take a stab at answering it. Crumbling rubber, for example, is a petroleum product. So technically, it's an oil discharge. It's a petroleum-based discharge, which could activate a variety of different responses from both the EPA and NOAA, from a what they call a natural resource damages process, where they can seek monetary compensation for cleanup and mitigation for damages. We don't know what this crumb rubber has done to the ecosystem. We do know it's widely spread, but we have no data yet on, what the fate of fish, perhaps, or any organisms within the food chain from ingesting it. Is it toxic? We've run some samples to the UW. They're running a variety of tests on it to find out the composition. We suspect the crumb rubber has a variety of different manufacturers' sources because it was astroturf that's been stockpiled from a variety of different sources and likely manufacturers, which probably use different ingredients in their development of the material. So it's all too early to know yet. But yeah, I mean, in my mind, the owners need to be held accountable for cleanup and impacts.
And
all I can say is that anybody who's been involved in youth sports and had to clean little bits of rubber out of their van for years after their kids grow up and go away knows this stuff is persistent and gets everywhere.
Exactly.
I would have thought that putting that in a river would be a terrible idea.
Yep, exactly. Yeah, we were just baffled. Why would you do this? Why would you think of astroturf in a river could possibly be a good idea? But it happened.
so we are at time. It is past 8, but I think I have one more parting question from Sue, and she's asking, what can the public do can the public do anything to help voice their opinions on action for the dam or pressure the owners to do something about this?
Absolutely. Send an email, send a letter to your electeds. Let them know how outraged you are by this occurrence. Tell them you want the owners held accountable, responsible. You want to see mitigation. Yeah, the sooner the better. Whether it's the Pierce County exec, the director of fisheries, commissioner of public lands, the director of wildlife, National Marine Fisheries Service, all of them should be the focus of a letter writing campaign, please.
Well, Russ, I want to thank you so much for joining us today and giving a fantastic presentation. You're a wealth of knowledge, and I'm sure that if I learned something, that everyone who else was joining this presentation definitely learned something too. So I really appreciate you taking the time to come talk with us today.
Thanks everyone for listening to this, and yeah, thanks for your interest in pursuing fish propagation and enhancement.
Thanks, Russ. Thanks, Jack. Thanks everybody for joining. Really appreciate it.